Welcome to the first episode of the Chimera Literary Podcast. My name is Niladri, and we're starting off today with two stories from classic and contemporary literature. Our first story was written in 1920 by H.P. Lovecraft and is entitled Nyarlathotep. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audience void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger. A danger widespread and all-embracing, such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demoniac alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. The fellahin knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep and shuddered, and where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. Never before had the screams of nightmare been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wished they could forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon as it glimmered on green waters, gliding under bridges and old steeples, crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, the great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend had told me of him and of the impelling fascination and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friend said they were horrible and impressive beyond my most fevered imaginings, and what was thrown on a screen in the darkened room prophesied things none but Nyarlathotep dared prophesy, and in the sputter of his sparks there was taken from men that which had never been taken before, yet which showed only in the eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, through the stifling night and up the endless stairs into the choking room. And shadowed on a screen I saw hooded forms amidst ruins, and yellow evil faces peering from behind fallen monuments. And I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the teeming, cooling sun. Then the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood up on end, while shadows, more grotesque than I can tell, came out and squatted on the heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drove us all out, down the dizzy stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. We swore to one another that the city was exactly the same and still alive, and when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed the company over and over again and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious, involuntary marching formations and seemed to know our destinations, though we dared not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to show where the tramways had run. And again we saw a tramcar, lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up into narrow columns, each of which seemed drawn in a different direction. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with a laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked toward the open country, and presently I felt a chill which was not of the hot autumn, for as we stalked out on the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon glitter of evil snows. Trackless, inexplicable snows swept asunder in one direction only, where lay a gulf all the blacker for its glittering walls. The column seemed very thin indeed, as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-litten snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished. But my power to linger was slight. As if beckoned by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirled blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation, corpses of dead worlds with swords that were cities, charnel winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the world's vague ghosts of monstrous things, half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest on nebulous rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzy vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolting graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes, from inconceivable unlighted chambers beyond time, the detestable pounding and piping whereon to dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly, the gigantic tenebrous ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles, whose soul is Nyarlathotep. Our second story is called Demons, written by S.D. Johnson, and it features in a collection of short stories titled Scorpion Tales, which can be found on Amazon. You can check out the link for it in the description below. February 21st, 1921, Brno, Czechoslovakia. I had stopped for the night in the small village of Brno and had found lodgings in what appeared to be his oldie inn. I had stored my bag in the room and come downstairs to take advantage of the fire in the bar. "He drinks the profits," the old man at the older table said, nodding at the innkeeper. "He'll drink himself to death, haunted he is, and drowning in debt." I looked more closely at the owner of the inn. He was a shriveled-looking man, slightly hunched at the shoulders, and with eyes that looked as if they had peered at the gates of hell and were terrified of returning and stepping through them. "That your car?" he asked, peering out of the window into the dusk at my Austin 20, my one possession and my only means of trying to keep myself one step ahead of my demons. I nodded, and the old man at the bar glanced at me and raised his brows knowingly and rolled his eyes, one of his priorities. "It does its job," I replied, not wanting to get myself into an argument. "I used to drive a Graf and Stift," he said, as if I should know immediately the significance of that. "I was a chauffeur to royalty in that beauty. Mind you, that was just for the one day, but it was a day that changed my life, I can tell you. I was there for the night. I was in no hurry to retreat to my nightmares in my cold and sparse room, and the bar was warm and comforting. I ordered another beer and prepared myself to hear his tale, which the old man had clearly heard too many times. He looked at me as if to say he had warned me and drained his glass. "Royalty, you say?" I asked. "King George?" He laughed, but the laughter was bitter. "You British. You think you rule the world, you and your beloved King Emperor. Let me tell you, I worked that day for the heir to the greatest empire the world ever knew, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What do you say to that?" I had nothing to say, but as I had no wish to leave the warmth of the bar, I said politely, "That must have been quite a day for you." He threw his head back and roared with hollow laughter. "For me, you say?" "For the world, I say." He came from behind the bar and settled into the leather armchair by the fire with a very large drink and nodded for me to join him on the opposite seat. The old man from the table nodded farewell and left. "It was June," he said, "a beautiful sunny day. My boss and I picked them up at the station in Sarajevo. They were friends of his, you see, and he was out to gain favor, so he put me and the car at their disposal." "Who was your boss?" He looked irritated. "Count Herrick," he replied, but I was none the wiser. I realized he expected me to let him tell his story uninterrupted. "They were going to inspect the troops up at the garrison. He was a major general, you see, as well as heir to the empire, and that rank entitled them both to be on public display on big military occasions. He wanted to give his wife some limelight, since the royal family refused to acknowledge her. They didn't think she was good enough for him, poor woman, but he was besotted." He paused to take a long drink from his glass before continuing. "The crowds were about 8 deep as we drove along Apple Quay. They were cheering and waving, and the two of them were lapping it up. They were all lovey-dovey. It was their wedding anniversary, you see, and they loved all the attention." You could see from his expression that he was back there, able to see the images and hear the sounds of that day. I was still not sure who they were, but the unfolding story offered more cheer than that Spartan room upstairs and the horrors of the night, so I nodded enthusiastically and he went on. "All of a sudden there was one hell of a bang on the bonnet. Damn me, it was a hand grenade. So I swerved, and it bounced off and blew up the car behind. The two in that car really caught it, and it took out about 20 of the crowd as well. There was smoke and screaming and blood everywhere. We drove like hell to the governor's residence and he was flaming mad when he got there. He let them have it, I can tell you. Stupid man. He had known all along that there was likely to be an attempt on his life, but he had ignored all the warnings. He wanted to give her the royal pomp and glory treatment. Then they decided, all regal like, to go to the hospital to visit the wounded. But typical, they didn't tell us, drivers. So off we went on the original route to the garrison. He took another large swig from his glass. We turned off Applequay as planned, and the official in the car started shouting at me to stop and go back. So I slammed the brakes on. As soon as we stopped, I put the car in reverse, and would you believe it, I stalled it. I swear to God, I never stalled any car before, and then, there he was, the little shit, Gavrilo Princip, standing there with his Browning in his hand, and he fired 2 shots. The first got her, and the other got him. He paused to refill his glass. They reckon they call him Gavrilo after the Archangel Gabriel, more like the angel of bleeding death. Only 19 he was, and there he was, calm as you like, just shot 2 people in front of witnesses, trying to take his cyanide pill like it's a mint humbug or something, but they got him. The story was starting to make connections in my exhausted brain, dulled after the day's drive of 8 hours. This man, this innkeeper, with his sallow skin and tormented eyes, was a major player in world history. I felt my stomach churn as I looked at him. You were driving the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife when they were shot? I asked. Of course I was, he said. Who do you think I was driving? The Emperor of Bleeding China? Yes, I'm Leopold Loika, he said. The bringer of war. He laughed, but there was no humor there. This man had set the history of the 20th century on his bloody course just by taking a wrong turn and stalling a car. If he hadn't taken the wrong turn, if he hadn't stalled the car, then Princip would have just gone home. Instead, my host had delivered the Archduke Ferdinand straight to the barrel of Princip's Browning automatic. I had to hear the end of his story. This little man, whose accidental stalling of a car had changed the history of the world. Do you know they made me send telegrams of apology? I had to send one to the Emperor Franz Joseph, one to Kaiser Bill, and one to their children, as if it was my fault they got shot. He shook his head. Anyway, when the old man Franz Joseph died and the Emperor Charles took over, he went and gave me 400,000 crowns, didn't he? Made me take the blame, they did, but Charlie, God bless him, he tried to see me right. I set myself up in this place, and you know, I've lost just about every single crown. I'm cursed. No matter what I do, I'm cursed. He lapsed into his own thoughts. What happened to Princip? I asked, trying to give him some relief from the painful reverie. They put him on trial. I had to give evidence for the prosecution. Do you know he was just 27 days too young for the death penalty? Not that it did him any good. He got 20 years solitary, but he went and got TB and died. He stood up, shook his head, and poured us both another drink. He returned, clearly back in the present once more. You want to see Franz Ferdinand's braces? I've got them behind the bar, still covered in his blood, though that's gone brown now. I got a bit of a bracelet too. Sophie her name was. He got them from below the counter and handed them to me. And there I stood, history in my hands, and in the presence of this tortured man who had set the great conflict, the so-called war to end all wars, in motion. I went to bed and slept soundly for the first time in years. I had met a man whose demons were so infinitely greater than my own that perspective could finally enter my head. Yes, I had the images of the trenches seared on my brain, but this man had lit the torch that set the world on fire when he stalled that car. He had to live each day with the deaths of millions weighing upon his soul. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. The second episode of the Chimera Literary Podcast will be uploaded soon. Thanks again. Hope you'll join in again. Goodbye.